We all like to believe the idea that we would have stood up to dictators like Idi Amin or Adolf Hitler had we have been alive and in those countries, but the reality is that doing so takes an enormous amount of bravery that only a certain number of people possess. Dictators, sort of by definition, tend not to welcome too much dissent or opposition, and some have been known, and I hate to be the one to break it to you, to be fairly violent when it comes to suppressing those who dare to challenge them. Joseph Stalin, for example, used the killing of his right-hand man Sergei Kirov as a pretext for his Great Purge, in which at least 700,000 supposed enemies of the state were murdered. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, military general Suharto seized power following a failed coup attempt against his predecessor in 1965, proceeding to slaughter between 500,000 to more than 1 million real or perceived communists, leftists, atheists, and ethnic Chinese. Even today, we see the dangers of dissent in supposed democracies, let alone in countries like Eritrea, Syria, Turkmenistan, or North Korea, where you can be prosecuted and killed for committing thought crimes, let alone for saying something that might offend the ruling regime. With that in mind then, I wanted to celebrate those footballers, both past and present, who have been brave enough to stand up to tyrants, risking often their careers and in some cases their lives for what they believe to be right. I am doing so, in fact, on the anniversary of the death of Stan Cullis, who was dropped by England in 1938 after refusing the Football Association's demand to perform a Nazi salute before a game against Germany, just 1 year before the outbreak of World War II. Without further ado then, who has been rather muted on the issue of authoritarian leaders, at least as far as I'm aware, here are 7 footballers who stood up to dictators. 7th, Socrates. The quintessential cool footballer, the world fell in love with Socrates at the 1982 World Cup, thanks to his style and elegance with a ball at his feet, but back home in Brazil, Socrates had bigger fish to fry outside of the sport. In fact, outside of about 90 minutes every weekend, football was very rarely Socrates' primary concern. Born into an upper-middle-class family and highly educated, Socrates was 10 years old when Brazil's left-wing president, João Goulart, was overthrown in a coup carried out by the Brazilian armed forces with the support of the United States. A military dictatorship was established, and it was seeing his distraught father tearing apart books that he loved in the family's home library, fearing reprisals from the dictatorship should they be found, that radicalized a young Socrates. After leaving college, obtaining a bachelor's degree in medicine, and becoming a professional footballer, Socrates became increasingly political. He began writing columns for newspapers on sport, politics, and economics, before deciding to practice what he preached at Corinthians. With the consent of the club's president, at the beginning of the 1980s, Socrates founded Democracia Corinthiana, an ideological movement in which Corinthians' own players assumed control of the club with a one-person, one-vote system. The club implemented direct democracy and enjoyed great success, winning the Campeonato Paulista in 1982 and then again in 1983. It also put Socrates in direct opposition to Brazil's military dictatorship, who quite rightly viewed him and his movement as a threat, but it was a showdown that Socrates had been preparing for and was more than ready to engage in. In April 1984, Socrates spoke out in favour of diretas já, literally direct now, though typically translated as free elections now, which engaged in acts of civil unrest to pressure the military dictatorship into holding direct presidential elections. In front of a crowd of 2 million people in Cathedral Square in Sao Paulo, Socrates announced that if the dictatorship didn't hold elections, he would relocate to Italy, where he had received several contract offers. The dictatorship held firm, and true to his word, Socrates joined Fiorentina. A hero in Brazil, Socrates' opposition to the military dictatorship, his democratic movement at Corinthians, and his self-imposed exile were all powerful moments and movements in Brazil's collective body politic. And 12 months later, in 1985, the dictatorship fell, Brazil's first direct presidential election in more than 20 years was held, and Socrates returned. A giant of a man, it is a crying shame that Socrates was addicted to alcohol and sadly died in 2011 at the age of 57. Otherwise, who knows? Perhaps he would have been able to stop Bolsonaro. If anyone could, it was him. 6th, Johan Cruyff. We start this 7 with two global icons of the sport, and Johan Cruyff is truly one of the greatest footballers of all time. A man who found football to be second nature, Cruyff scored a goal a game in his teens at Ajax before shaping the entire sport in his image. One could argue that there hasn't been a more significant or influential footballer than the Dutchman this side of World War II. Incidentally, it was just months before the outbreak of World War II that Francisco Franco, perhaps better known as General Franco these days, seized control of the whole of Spain. Brought to power initially in 1936 through a coup supported by fascists in both Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, which overthrew the democratically elected leftist government of Spain, Franco established a military dictatorship, which in turn began the Spanish Civil War. After he emerged victorious in 1939, Franco ruled over the formerly Republican territories, which still maintained strong non-Castilian cultural identities and opposition to him, most notably in the Basque Country and in Catalonia, with an iron fist. In the 1950s, Athletic Club and Barcelona, based in the Basque Country and Catalonia, who had been Spain's two most successful clubs up to that point, were forced to change their names and identities, and their successes collapsed. The degree to which Franco influenced the latter of those three, and Real Madrid's simultaneous rise, is greatly debated. But it is within this context that Johan Cruyff joined Barcelona in 1973. Having led Ajax to 3 successive European Cups, the club from Amsterdam wanted to sell Cruyff to Real Madrid, who had registered the highest bid. Cruyff refused, forcing through a move to Barcelona instead, and declaring that he would never play for a team which represented Franco or was associated with Francoist Spain. It was a bold statement, not like turning down Real Madrid for Barcelona now, given that Barca were languishing in the bottom half of the La Liga table at the time, down in 14th place and just 4 points above the relegation zone, and when you add in naming his son Jordi, a Catalan name, at a time when they had been banned by Franco, it would be fair to say that Cruyff endeared himself pretty quickly to the Barca faithful. His masterful display in only his second Clásico, which Barcelona won 5-0 at the Bernabeu, was described by one New York Times journalist as having done more for the spirit of the Catalan people in 90 minutes than many politicians in years of struggle. That season, Barcelona claimed their first La Liga title since 1960. Cruyff was a Dutchman, Amsterdam born and bred, indelibly tied to Ajax, who he turned into 3-time European champions whilst shaping the club and the Dutch national team. But he adopted Catalan's struggle as his own. He publicly opposed Franco at a time when most were far more tight-lipped, and he ended up having just as profound of an impact on Barca as he had done at Ajax. 5th, Fyodor Smolov. Freedom is not guaranteed to anyone, and dictators are not just remnants of the past. In 2023, approximately 70% of the world's population, more than 5.5 billion people, live in dictatorships or under authoritarian rule, and most of the remaining 30% live in distinctly imperfect democracies. Vladimir Putin has been the de facto dictator of the Russian Federation since 1999, during which time the poisonous Dobby the House Elf lookalike has become increasingly authoritarian. That authoritarianism has been ramped up greatly over the past 12 months, since Russia's mass escalation and full-scale invasion of Ukraine, causing the largest migration out of Russia since the 1917 revolution, and fierce crackdowns against almost any opposition to the war, or indeed, even just describing what Putin calls a special military operation as a war at all. Fyodor Smolov, who is one of Russia's most high-profile footballers, was the first player to speak out in opposition to the war. Most Russian players haven't commented on the invasion, meanwhile Smolov's international strike partner, Ertem Dzyuba, back from, when Russia actually had a recognised national team, hit back at Ukrainian players who criticised the silence of Russian players on his social media accounts. Smolov, you could argue, hasn't actually stood up to Putin directly, or even mentioned him, simply having shared the message "No to War" on his Instagram on the day of the invasion. But in Putin's Russia, opposition to the special military operation is opposition to him and makes you a traitor to the Russian Federation. Bizarrely, Smolov's fiancée, Maria Yumasheva, is the granddaughter of Boris Yeltsin, Russia's irredeemably corrupt first president, who sold off the nation's assets for pennies on the dollar to a handful of oligarchs. And her mother, Tatyana Yumasheva, a close friend of Roman Abramovich's, is said to have been the woman who actually convinced Yeltsin to crown Putin as his successor. Yumasheva has also criticised Russia's invasion of Ukraine, despite her role in making Putin president, as has her daughter, who was just 17 when a 29-year-old Smolov publicly announced his relationship with her. I know, it's a bit sus. Smolov was previously married to Victoria Lopareva, who was crowned as Miss Russia in 2003, back when his current fiancée was just 1 year old. Igor Denisov, who won 54 caps for Russia before retiring, is the other high-profile footballer to have criticised Putin's actions, describing the war as a catastrophe and stating, "Maybe they'll put me in jail or kill me for these words, but I'm telling it like it is." End quote. Fourth, Amo Baba. There have been few dictators in modern history who have been as sick and sadistic as Saddam Hussein, a man who would order that family members cheer and celebrate, whilst his secret police tortured and murdered their own relatives, before sending them a bill in the post for the bullets which had dealt the final fatal blow. That was pretty mild for Saddam's reign of terror. I am deliberately withholding the regime's most sadistic acts since they would almost certainly get this video demonetized, and perhaps even this entire channel. It is terrifying then, and I do genuinely mean blood-curdlingly terrifying, to think that Saddam's son, Uday Hussein, was frequently described as being even more committed to cruelty and sadism than his father. Thankfully, Uday never inherited the reins of power after he was killed in a gunfight and his father was deposed in 2003, though tragically, Saddam was only deposed after a US-led coalition invaded Iraq under false pretenses, and what followed for many Iraqis was even worse. Before he was killed by Americans in a gunfight in Mosul, Uday Hussein held numerous government roles, on account of his dad being a barbaric dictator and all, which included being the head of the Iraqi Olympic Committee and the head of the Iraq Football Association. Renowned for his propensity to torture, rape, and murder innocent people, Uday routinely tortured Iraqi athletes and footballers, particularly following defeats, and he was as despised as he was feared. None of this went unnoticed by Iraqi football legend Amo Baba, one of few men brave enough to stand up to Uday, and by extension Saddam. Baba was an Assyrian Iraqi, which put him immediately at odds with the Ba'athist regime. His goal-scoring feats made him one of the most famous faces in Iraq, and he went on to manage the national team on no fewer than 7 separate occasions. Baba loathed Uday, who lashed his players and did things that even Hitler could not imagine doing, in Baba's own words, which is why he regularly spoke out against him, and even humiliated Uday by turning down a medal from him in front of 50,000 fans. Uday threatened to kill Baba and cut off his tongue on numerous occasions, but Saddam wouldn't allow it, all too aware of Baba's popularity in the country at large. The greatest Iraqi footballer of all time, and a man of extraordinary bravery, Baba died in 2009, but lived long enough to see Uday killed and Iraq win the Asian Cup. I have made an entire video about Uday Hussein's reign of terror as head of the Iraqi FA, should any of you be interested. Third, Hakan Sukur. From the greatest Iraqi to one of the greatest Turkish footballers of all time, Hakan Sukur is his country's all-time leading goalscorer, having struck 51 times from 112 caps for the national team between 1992 and 2007. A big, strong, instinctive centre-forward who was absolutely lethal in the air, Sukur was nicknamed the Bull of the Bosphorus, and he spent the vast majority of his career starring for Galatasaray. Following his retirement from football in 2008, Sukur, who is of Albanian descent, entered politics, being elected as a Member of Parliament for the ruling Justice and Development Party. The party's leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was a friend of Sukur's and even performed his first marriage, which, admittedly, only lasted for 4 months. Sukur is a devotee of the Gulen movement, an Islamic sect led by the Turkish scholar and preacher Fethullah Gulen. Preaching a relatively moderate form of Islam and centrist politics, but opposing Turkey's secular leadership at the time, Gulen and Erdogan's then centre-right AKP party were natural allies. They formed a political allegiance after the AKP took power in 2002 in order to stave off pressure from Turkey's secularists, but once Erdogan had won 3 successive elections and feared Gulen's increasing influence and representation, particularly among Turkey's elites, he did what Erdogan does every time anyone opposes him these days, and declared them a terrorist organisation. Sukur resigned from the party and became an independent MP, but following a failed coup attempt in 2016, which Erdogan blamed on the Gulen movement, he used it as a justification for a mass purge. Sukur was one of many people accused of being complicit in the coup, having his assets seized and a warrant put out for his arrest. So in 2017, he fled Turkey to the United States. Sukur, whose father remained in Turkey and was arrested, subsequently opened a cafe in California, but he shut it down, having grown concerned with some of the strange customers who kept coming in. Now he drives for Uber and sells books part-time. It should be noted, since someone will be thinking it, that Erdogan is the least definitive dictator in this 7, given that Turkey still has elections. So does Russia, though, whose status as a dictatorship I suspect few people would dispute at this stage, and like Putin, Erdogan values the respectability that winning an election confers, but he wouldn't ever want to risk actually losing one. Turkey is also the only country, at least as far as I'm aware, that has actually banned one of my videos, which was about Erdogan's involvement with Istanbul Başakşehir. So yeah, screw you, Erdogan. Second, Matthias Sindelar. Football's most famous anti-fascist, Matthias Sindelar is a man who ought to have stadiums named after him and a statue outside of Austria Vienna's home ground. It wouldn't be the biggest statue, since Sindelar was just 5 foot 9 inches tall and stick thin. So thin, in fact, that one of his nicknames was Der Papiran, or the Paperman. Another one of Sindelar's nicknames was the Mozart of football, after another famous resident of Vienna, and just like Mozart, people flocked from all over Central Europe to witness the majesty and genius of Sindelar in the flesh. At a time of big, burly centre-forwards, Sindelar was an intricate and elegant technician who pioneered the role of the withdrawn forward. Undoubtedly one of, if not the greatest European player of the pre-war era, Sindelar was the star and captain of Austria's Wunder team during the 1930s, with whom he most likely would have won the 1934 World Cup, were it not for Mussolini's interference. That was Sindelar's first confrontation with fascism, but his mortal battle would be with Hitler and the Nazis. Unlike a lot of Austrians, Sindelar, who was actually born in modern-day Czech Republic and was of Czech descent, opposed reunification and saw the Führer for what he really was. At a game held between Germany and Vienna to celebrate the 1938 Anschluss, which was to be Austria's last game before their players became German and joined up with the German national team, legend has it that Sindelar celebrated his goal in a 2-0 win by celebrating extravagantly in front of senior Nazi officials. Aged 35 at the time, but still Austria's star man, the Nazis, whilst angered, were still insistent that Sindelar would represent them. Shindy declined the invitation though, the only player to do so, refusing to play under the flag of a regime that he despised. Despite having a half-Austrian team at the 1938 World Cup, Germany still went out in the first round, following a 4-2 defeat to Switzerland. Having been banned from playing football for a year, in January 1939, Sindelar and his girlfriend were found dead in their apartment in Vienna, the official verdict citing carbon monoxide poisoning as the cause. We will never know for sure whether the Nazis killed Sindelar. The documents from the inquest into his death mysteriously went missing, but we do know that the Gestapo had been following Sindelar and kept tabs on him, claiming that his pro-Czech, pro-Jew and anti-Nazi views could be considered dangerous. Well, today we celebrate Sindelar for his pro-Czech, pro-Jew and anti-Nazi views, an icon of resistance against tyranny and evil. For any Austrians watching this, please do start the campaign for something significant to be named in Sindelar's honour. It is quite frankly a travesty that all he's got is a street and a grave. First, Abdul Baset Al-Sarout. A man who is actually better known for his dissent and for taking up arms against an authoritarian regime than he is for his footballing prowess, Abdul Baset Al-Sarout was a goalkeeper who represented Syria at under 17 and under 20 level, and he was playing for Al-Karamah in the Syrian Premier League when the Syrian civil war began. Inspired by the wider Arab Spring protests in 2011, various domestic and foreign forces that opposed the Syrian government began to call for Assad's removal. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, renowned for his brutality and supported by Iran, Hezbollah, briefly Iraq, and most notably since 2015 Russia, attempted to violently suppress any and all opposition to him. Unfortunately, opposition to Assad is not wholly benevolent, to put it extremely mildly. Among a whole host of belligerents in the Syrian civil war, you have got the alternative Syrian interim government, which is supported by Turkey, Qatar, and formerly several Western states plus Saudi Arabia and Libya. Then you have got a raft of Salafi jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra Front, and most notably ISIS, which held about 30% of Syrian and 40% of Iraqi territory at its peak. And then you have got an autonomous region known as Rojava in northeast Syria, which is more secular and progressive and now enjoys the support of the United States and France. The ongoing civil war, which was at its most violent and deadly from 2012 to 2017, has probably claimed the lives of more than 500,000 people, as well as immiserating, impoverishing, and displacing many millions more. One of those more than 500,000 killed was Abdul Baset Al-Sarout, who quit football at the age of 19 to become a rebel commander. Nicknamed the Singer of the Revolution for his popular protest songs, and the Keeper of the Revolution because of his former job, Al-Sarout started out as an anti-Assad nationalist, but over time his views and speeches became increasingly Islamist in nature, capitalizing on rising forces in the war. Al-Sarout joined Jaish al-Islam, a rebel group affiliated with the Free Syrian Army, but he was accused by the Al-Nusra Front of having pledged allegiance to ISIS. Al-Sarout denied the claim, but didn't deny that he had considered joining ISIS, having felt at one time that they were the only group capable of overthrowing Assad, but rejecting them when he discovered that their primary interest was in forming an Islamic caliphate and not in toppling Assad. In fairness, they are literally called Islamic State. I mean, for all of their faults, I don't think that you can accuse them of being too ambivalent about their aims. In June 2019, Al-Sarout was shot and killed by the Syrian armed forces, along with 4 of his brothers, in the northwest Syrian offensive in his birthplace of Homs. That is it for today's video. Heavy watching, probably, I would imagine, but interesting nonetheless, I hope, and, you know, some stories that you might not have known about, and, yeah, you know, what more do you want? Hit the like button if you did enjoy it. Enjoy might be the wrong word. Again, if you found it interesting, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens and indeed for my backup channel, both of which should be on your screen now. You can also find me via the username @HITC Sevens on both Instagram and on Twitter. Cheers.